the voice from the shadow. In Jerusalem, winter's cold would seep into the bones like loneliness. The city was silent like a millennia-old history hiding behind stone walls. But that morning, the man sitting inside the armored black car coming from Ramat Aviv to Jerusalem was even quieter inside himself. Benjamin Netanyahu had been lost in thought for the longest time since he left the premiership. The crowds, flashes, journalists, protocols, and meetings he was used to for years were now gone. Withdrawing from politics hadn't been easy. But over time he had learned to make peace with silence. Yet that day felt different. There was an uneasiness inside him, something he couldn't define. When he decided to visit the old synagogue in Jerusalem, it wasn't just to pray, but maybe to seek answers. He had no security detail, only his driver David accompanied him. As the car approached Damascus Gate, Netanyahu suddenly said, "Stop the car, I want to walk a bit." After a brief hesitation, David obeyed. Bundled up in a dark blue coat against the cold, Netanyahu began walking. The winding stones of the old city streets reminded him of the struggles he had fought for these lands years ago. But with each step, a new feeling mixed with those memories, maybe a desire for change, maybe a search for redemption. A beggar caught his attention on the street. But this was no ordinary sight. The man was crouched on the ground, scribbling something on a piece of paper. In front of him was a bowl with a few coins. The man did not even look at Netanyahu. The former prime minister approached. "Hello," Netanyahu said softly but firmly. The beggar did not raise his head. "Hi," he replied. "What's your name?" Netanyahu asked. "Eliyahu," said the man, finally lifting his head and looking into Netanyahu's eyes. Netanyahu froze. There was not fatigue in those eyes, but wisdom. As if carrying not the weight of years, but the meaning of ages. 2. Eliyahu's story. When Eliyahu began to speak, time seemed to stop. "What does my story matter?" he said at first. But then words long kept inside began to spill from his lips. "I was once a teacher. Someone who dedicated his life to children, learning about life from books. But then the war came. I lost my family. I lost my home. And then my faith. But maybe most of all, I lost myself." Netanyahu was silent. He did not interrupt. Instead of preparing a politician's usual speech, he simply listened for the first time. Eliyahu continued. "You realize what you love when you lose it. But you don't know what to do with that love. Now, I'm just here. Sometimes I call out to God, sometimes just to myself. But the answer never comes." Netanyahu took a deep breath. He was about to take money from his wallet and hand it to him. But Eliyahu stopped him with a gesture. "Not money. I need an answer." "What did you lose, Mr. Netanyahu?" The question hit Netanyahu's heart like a stone. It was as if his life was reflected back to him in a mirror. Power, authority, decisions, debates. But what about humanity? At that moment, the former prime minister made a decision. He would help this man not only by giving money but by truly entering his life. Maybe this help would be a cleansing for himself as well. 3. In the shadow of the past. From that day on, Netanyahu left his home early every morning and secretly descended into the narrow streets of Jerusalem to visit Eliyahu. The first days were spent just talking. But those talks were no ordinary conversations. Every word shook the stones that had been piled inside Netanyahu for years. Eliyahu's words flowed like a river bursting from a philosopher's silence. "The longer a man sits in a chair, the more he forgets how to stand," he said one day. That phrase deeply shook Netanyahu. The chair he had sat in for years, the premiership, had lifted him high but slowly weakened his connection with people. Now, thanks to this man on the street, he was truly facing people for the first time. Especially the most helpless ones. One morning, Netanyahu brought warm coffee and a simit, Turkish sesame bread, to Eliyahu. But this time, he had another plan. Eliyahu, Netanyahu said, I want to take you somewhere today. Eliyahu squinted. Where? An old school. I traced the place where you used to teach. Let's take a look together. Eliyahu hesitated at first but then nodded. Slowly, he stood up and took Netanyahu's outstretched hand. This was no longer charity, but a bond. Two lonely men began walking to trace the footprints of the past. 4. Inside the ruined classrooms. The school building was still standing but had become a ruin. Its windows were shattered, walls covered with graffiti. Eliyahu remembered the letters he once wrote on the blackboard. Aleph. Bet. Gimel. He touched the traces of letters on the walls. I used to tell dreams to children here. Now I can't even dream. Netanyahu looked around. The classrooms once echoed with thousands of children's voices. But now only the wind whispered. This school can be rebuilt, Netanyahu said. The children in this neighborhood need a teacher like you again. Eliyahu smiled, but the smile was sad. I only talk to my past now, Benjamin. I'm not enough for the future. At that moment, Netanyahu made a decision. This help would no longer be individual. Eliyahu's story had to become the voice of thousands. Rebuilding this ruined school would be making amends for past mistakes. The Resurrection Project. A week later, the former Prime Minister appeared in the media again. But not with the usual poses. He was with Eliyahu. In front of the old school building. He launched a social campaign called the Resurrection Project. In his speech he said, I have led this country for years. But maybe for the first time, I am standing shoulder to shoulder with a citizen. This school is not just made of stones. It is a symbol of the conscience we lost, the values we forgot. News quickly spread throughout the country. Some media mocked, others praised. But most of the public embraced the initiative. Donations poured in. Construction resumed. But most importantly, Eliyahu began teaching again. During his first lesson he said to the class, sometimes life knocks you down. But when you are down, you learn to look at the sky. And when someone reaches out to you, lift not only your hand but also your heart. 6. Cleansing. Netanyahu was now at the school every week. He and Eliyahu went classroom to classroom answering children's questions. But this time, he spoke not as a politician but as a human. His pride melted in Eliyahu's silence. One day, sitting in the schoolyard, Netanyahu said, Eliyahu, I am grateful to you. You taught me life again. I saw the power in weakness. There were tears in Eliyahu's eyes. I only showed you my own brokenness. But you turned it into a bridge. True leadership is building bridges on ruins. 7. The Miracle of Jerusalem. Months later, the school was fully renovated. Its new name, Eliyahu Baruch Education Center. At the opening ceremony, Netanyahu did not speak. He handed the microphone to Eliyahu, who said just one sentence. God turns the hands of those willing to help into miracles. The crowd stood and applauded. But the applause was not for a single man, it was for the friendship, forgiveness and rebirth of two people. That day, many said they witnessed a real miracle in Jerusalem. Perhaps the miracle was born not from a man's power, but from the change in his heart. 8. The door to the past opens. 2 weeks after the school opening, Eliyahu woke up early every morning to check classrooms, help teachers and read books to children. But something troubled him. Every night alone, he had the same dream. A dark tunnel. A table inside. A young soldier at the head of the table. Eliyahu handing him a paper. On it was only one name, Benjamin. One day, Netanyahu noticed Eliyahu's tired, distracted eyes. Is something wrong? He asked. Eliyahu stayed silent for a long time. Then, swallowing a secret he had kept for years, he spoke. Actually, I met you many years ago, Benjamin. But you can't remember me. Because you were only 19 then, a young soldier. I was a quiet dissident within the state at that time. I gave you a letter. Netanyahu froze. In that letter, I wrote about the pains this nation would face in the coming decade. They called me crazy. But I was just an observer and a teacher. That day you said to me, "It's impossible for the country to go so badly." But then everything happened. Terror, discrimination, corruption. Do you understand now why I was silent? Netanyahu bowed his head. He remembered. That strange day. A man with trembling hands gave him a letter at training camp. He hadn't read it, had thrown it away. Because he was too busy, because it was untimely. My bitterness is not towards life, said Eliyahu. It's that no one listened. But now you listen, and that's enough. Tears filled Netanyahu's eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt ashamed for not reading that letter. And that shame planted the first seed of true change. 9. A new war, poverty. The success of the Resurrection Project was not limited to one school. Netanyahu gathered some of his old team again. But this time, not for politics, but for social transformation. Their goal was clear: to help the homeless, the poor, and orphan children in Jerusalem and surrounding areas. But the help would not be just clothes and food, but work, education, and hope. On Eliyahu's suggestion, the project was renamed the Second Chance Movement. Netanyahu was an ordinary volunteer in this movement. Every week, he reviewed the file of a homeless person, read their life story, and researched how they could help. One day, a file caught his attention, named Rachel Ziv. 34 years old. Mother of 2, abandoned by her husband years ago. Living on the street. Netanyahu wanted to meet her. They met in a small cafe. The woman was wary at first. "Are you really that Netanyahu?" she asked. "Yes, but now I'm just Benjamin. I want to help." The woman began to cry. "For the first time in years, someone called me by my name. Not a number." Netanyahu arranged a job training plan for Rachel. Enrolled her in a cooking school. Found a temporary daycare for her children. Within 2 months, Rachel was on her feet. One day she came with a letter. "Dear Mr. Netanyahu, you helped me, but more importantly, you reminded me who I am. I will never forget this." Netanyahu kept the letter. At that moment, he understood this war was far more meaningful than any he had fought before. Enemies and slanders. However, this rapid rise began to disturb some. Former politicians, media owners, interest groups. Netanyahu's conscientious transformation was holding a mirror to their faces. Slander spread, using poverty, refreshing his image, forming a secret party. Eliyahu met all these accusations with silence. But Netanyahu chose to remain silent for the first time. "If we are on the right path," said Eliyahu, "the noise will increase. Because darkness hates light." One morning, a fire broke out at the shelter where Eliyahu stayed. It was suspected arson. Luckily, no one was harmed, but it was a big message: stop. But they didn't stop. On the contrary, they accelerated. Now not only schools but vocational centers, psychological counseling centers, and addiction recovery programs were opening. 11. Eliyahu's last gift. By the end of the year, the Second Chance movement had touched thousands of lives. It was no longer just a movement but a conscience uprising. People wrote the same slogan everywhere, in social media, on billboards, on street walls. "You are not alone." But in the midst of this victory, one night Eliyahu was hospitalized. His heart was weak. Age, years on the streets, neglected. All had caught up. Netanyahu rushed to the hospital. He found Eliyahu pale but smiling. "Don't worry," Eliyahu said. "Every life can be summed up in a sentence. Mine is, I was not late." Netanyahu held his hand. "If it weren't for you, I would still be wandering with a stone heart. You taught me humanity." Eliyahu whispered as he closed his eyes, remembering humanity. That is the real victory. That night, Eliyahu quietly passed away. But he spoke volumes to the heart of a nation. 12. The heart of a nation. After Eliyahu's death, a deep silence fell over the streets of Jerusalem. But this silence was not of pain, it was of respect. Eliyahu had become a legend in people's hearts. Netanyahu wanted the funeral to be simple, quiet, but honorable. But the people would not allow it. Tens of thousands gathered in front of the synagogue in Jerusalem. They held cardboard signs with the same phrase, "I was not late." That day, Netanyahu took the stage with tears in his eyes. He took the microphone but could not speak for a moment. Then with a deep breath, he said, "I have led this country for many years. But the greatest leadership I learned was from a homeless man. Eliyahu Baruch taught me what truly matters: to listen, to understand, to change." He was not a national hero. But for me, he was a true teacher. The crowd quietly wept. We will carry on his legacy. No one in these lands will be left alone. Everyone deserves a second chance. After the ceremony, these words were engraved on the tombstone. Eliyahu Baruch, once forgotten, then always remembered. 13. Light rises from Jerusalem. Months passed. The Second Chance movement echoed not only inside Israel but beyond borders. In Europe, Africa, even America, people heard the story. It was no longer just a movement but a wave of conscience. The United Nations invited Netanyahu to a special session. But Netanyahu did something unusual. On the stage, he spoke accompanied by Rachel, a former homeless young woman and a student. He said, "The world changes not through great wars, but through small hopes. A child's notebook, a mother's warm bed, the name of a homeless person. These are the true miracles of humanity." The diplomats stood up. Applause lasted for minutes. 14. The letters box. Eliyahu's old shelter became a memorial center. Its walls bore his words, pictures, and story. Netanyahu often visited. Each time, he read the messages in the letters box, opened for him. One day, he found a note from a small child. "Dear Eliyahu, when I grow up, I want to be someone like you. But not homeless, hopeful." Reading these words, Netanyahu could not hold back tears. Eliyahu was gone physically, but his seed had sprouted in hundreds of children's hearts. 15. The call to return. One morning, an old friend came to Netanyahu. "Benjamin, the people want to see you as prime minister again. The country needs you." Netanyahu smiled but shook his head. "I'm on a different path now. Leadership for me is no longer on podiums but in hearts." He did not return to politics. Instead, he took on a greater mission, being the architect of social healing. 16. The Eliyahu Foundation. A year later, a foundation bearing Eliyahu's name was established. The Eliyahu Foundation for Human Dignity. Its goals: combating homelessness, access to education, psychological support, addiction recovery, women's and children's rights. Starting from Israel, it operated in many Middle Eastern countries. Books for Palestinian children, aid packages for Lebanese mothers, scholarships for Syrian refugees. What began with Netanyahu's outstretched hand was no longer just a movement but a humanitarian revolution. 17. The Last Dream. One night Netanyahu dreamed of Eliyahu. He was sitting in the same street, but this time cleanly dressed and bright-faced, holding an old book. "I am here now," Eliyahu said, "but you are still there. Your road is long, but your heart is right." Netanyahu woke and immediately went walking in the Jerusalem streets at dawn. He went to the place where Eliyahu first Saturday. On the ground was still his scratch, a star and a heart. He looked up to the sky and whispered to himself, "We are not late." 18. Epilogue, the New Generation. Years later, a TV program was made. The topic: Light from the Past, the story of Eliyahu and Netanyahu. One child on the show said, "I was born on the street. But thanks to Eliyahu, I grew up with books. And now I want to be a doctor." Netanyahu was sitting in the audience, old but with eyes still shining. The host turned to him, "Mr. Netanyahu, what is your final word?" He smiled. "If asked what power is, I'd say, it is preventing someone from falling." Then he addressed all the children. "It is never too late. Life sometimes teaches the strongest. Lessons through the weakest bodies. Listen. See. Love.